The Sh-47 thundered over the ridgeline, its rotors beating a brutal rhythm against the thin, frigid air. Below, FOB Kestrel's perch clung to the mountainside like a desperate prayer, a cluster of sand-colored tents and HESCO barriers against an unforgiving canvas of rock and snow. For the soldiers of Task Force Vigilance, the sound of an inbound chopper was usually a welcome one, a promise of mail, hot food, or replacements. This time it brought only a puzzle. A single figure disembarked, hunched against the rotor wash. The person wore sterile, gray cold-weather gear, devoid of rank, patches, or any identifying marks. A simple black pack was slung over one shoulder, and in one hand, they carried a dull gray data slate. As the Chinook lifted, swirling snow in its wake, the figure straightened. It was a woman, her face lined with the kind of patient erosion that comes from decades of staring into the middle distance. Her hair, a mix of iron and silver, was pulled back in a tight, functional bun. She could have been a logistician, an auditor from some forgotten Pentagon subbasement, or a civilian contractor sent to fix the perpetually failing water purifiers. Sergeant Marcus Croft, leaning against a stack of ammo crates with his fire team, watched her arrival with casual disdain. He was young, sharp-jawed, and carried the easy confidence of a man who had proven himself in a firefight. To him and his men, the world was divided into two groups: those who shared the risk at the sharp end and everyone else. This woman was so clearly everyone else. "Look what the cat dragged in," murmured Private Sanchez, nudging Croft. "Think she knows where the coffee pot is?" Croft let a slow, crooked grin spread across his face. "Doubtful. Probably here to count our bayonets and make sure we're filling out our paperwork in triplicate." He pushed himself off the crates and sauntered over, his posture a carefully calibrated mix of nonchalance and authority. The woman paused, her gaze sweeping over the camp's layout, taking in the placement of the perimeter towers, the vehicle depot, the command tent. Her eyes missed nothing. "Ma'am," Croft said, his voice a little too loud, a little too friendly. "Welcome to the icebox. You look a bit lost. Command tent's that way if you're looking for the colonel. Mess hall's the other way, if you're just looking for a warm seat." She turned her head, and her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, settled on him. They were unervingly still. There was no offense, no reaction to his patronizing tone. She simply registered his presence. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, her voice calm and even, carrying no hint of the altitude that left most newcomers gasping. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, then continued on her path toward the command tent, her boots crunching methodically on the frozen gravel. Croft was left standing there, his joke having landed with all the impact of a snowflake. He felt a flicker of annoyance. She hadn't even given him the satisfaction of being offended. She had simply dismissed him. He shrugged, turning back to his team. "Pencil pusher," he grunted, and they all chuckled, the moment forgotten as they went back to the familiar, tangible work of cleaning their rifles. Inside the command tent, the air was thick with the smell of canvas, diesel fuel, and stale coffee. Colonel Madsen stood before a large tactical map, his back rigid. He was a man who believed in order, in schedules, in plans executed with unvarying precision. He had been informed a Pentagon observer was arriving, and he already resented the intrusion. An observer meant reports, evaluations, and second-guessing from people thousands of miles away who didn't understand the brutal reality of this posting. The tent flap opened, letting in a gust of frigid air, and the woman entered. She moved to the side, out of the way, waiting to be acknowledged. Madsen didn't turn around for a full minute. He continued tracing a planned convoy route on the map with a red marker. Finally, he capped the pen and turned, his expression stern. "You're the observer," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," she replied. "Reed, is it?" he asked, glancing at a message on his own data slate. "Evelyn Reed." "Right," he gestured vaguely to a young officer hovering nervously by the radio consoles. "Lieutenant Hayes will be your minder. He'll show you to your quarters, get you acquainted with the layout. Stay out of the TOC during active operations. My people have work to do. We run a tight ship here, Ms. Reed. We don't have time for distractions. His tone was clipped, professional, but the message was clear. You are a nuisance. I understand, Colonel, she said, her expression unchanging. Madsen gave a curt nod, his duty done, and turned back to his map. He had already put her out of his mind. She was just another box to check, a bureaucratic ghost to be tolerated until she floated away. Hayes scurried over, his face flushed with the anxiety of his assignment. Ma'am, if you'll follow me, I can show you where you'll be bunking. She followed the young lieutenant out of the tent, her presence already fading from the command staff's awareness like a passing shadow. The dismissal was absolute. She was nothing here, a nameless, rankless civilian in a world defined by hierarchy and demonstrable strength. She was invisible. Lieutenant Hayes, earnest and eager to please, launched into his pre-prepared tour speech as they walked the perimeter. This is the western gun line, ma'am. We have interlocking fields of fire from towers 1 and 2, covering the valley approach. Standard 50 calibers and Mk-19 grenade launchers. Evelyn Reed listened in silence, her gaze fixed not on the guns, but on the terrain beyond them. What's your dead space? She asked, her voice quiet but clear over the whistling wind. Hayes blinked. Ma'am. Your fields of fire, she clarified. You have a blind spot behind that rock formation 200 meters out. And the gully to the north, it provides a covered approach to within 50 meters of your wire. Is it mined? The lieutenant's tour guide smile faltered. He consulted his own mental map, a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. The gully, yes, ma'am. I believe it's designated as a restricted zone. As for the formation, the patrols cover it. Patrols can be ambushed, Reed stated simply. Redundancy. Ma'am. Your communications. Primary is SATCOM, I assume. What's the backup? Troposcatter link and then standard HF radio, burst transmission capable, Hayes recited, sounding more like he was answering a test question. And the power grid for those systems? Is it isolated from the camp's main generator? Hayes stared at her. These weren't the questions an auditor asked. Auditors asked about fuel consumption logs and ammunition inventories. These were the questions a planner asked. Commander. He felt a sudden, unnerving sense of being the student, not the guide. I'd have to check the schematics, ma'am, he stammered. She gave another one of her small, non-committal nods and fell silent, leaving the lieutenant to grapple with his own newfound uncertainty. He quickly showed her to a small, Spartan tent reserved for transient personnel and made a hasty retreat, eager to escape her unsettlingly sharp inquiries. Later that day, Reed made her way to the mess tent. The long, narrow space was crowded and loud, a cacophony of clattering trays and boisterous conversations. She took a tray of bland stew and found an empty spot at the end of a long table. The soldiers nearby, members of Sergeant Croft's squad, glanced at her, then pointedly turned back to their own circle, their body language forming an invisible wall. Croft himself sat across from them, holding court. He spotted Reed sitting alone, a solitary gray figure in a sea of camouflage. He saw an opportunity for some mild entertainment. He picked up his tray and ambled over, sliding onto the bench opposite her. His squadmates watched, smirking. Settling in all right, ma'am? He asked, his voice laced with false sincerity. It's adequate, Reed replied, not looking up from her stew. Good, good, Croft continued, undeterred. So we're all dying to know. What exactly does a Pentagon observer do way out here? You making sure our socks are folded correctly? Tallying up our paperclip usage for the bean counters back home? A few of his men snickered. It was a classic time-honored jab at the rear echelon, at the bureaucrats who knew nothing of the cold, the fear, the grit of life on the line. Reed finally lifted her eyes from her bowl. She looked at Croft, then glanced at his expectant audience. She took a slow, deliberate spoonful of stew. Something like that, she said, her voice flat. The simplicity of her response deflated him. There was no anger, no defensiveness, no attempt to justify her role. It was like punching water. She offered no friction, no resistance. Her placid demeanor made his condescension feel childish and loud. He felt his smirk waver. "Right?" he said, clearing his throat. "Well, don't let us stop you from observing." He pushed his chair back and retreated to his table, the laughter from his men a little less confident this time. They had expected a reaction, a confirmation of their superiority. Instead, they got nothing. The old woman was a ghost, a blank wall. Her days fell into a quiet routine. She spent hours in the corner of the Tactical Operations Center, a silent fixture against the back wall. The analysts and comm specialists, initially wary of her, soon learned to ignore her completely. She just stood there watching the screens, her hands clasped behind her back. Occasionally, she would make a note on her data slate, but she never spoke, never interfered. They saw her as furniture, a harmless eccentric sent by a bureaucracy that had too much time and money on its hands. That evening, Colonel Madsen called a command briefing. A major winter storm was forecast to hit the region within 24 hours. More importantly, a critical resupply convoy, callsign Packhorse, was already en route, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and parts for the failing generator. "The forecast is severe," Madsen announced, pointing to a weather projection on the main screen. "Whiteout conditions expected. Packhorse is to proceed to Waypoint Zulu, a sheltered canyon, and hold there until the storm passes. They are well defended and the route is secure. We'll retrieve them once visibility improves." He exuded confidence. His plan was sound, conservative, and by the book. In the back of the tent, Evelyn Reed stood motionless, her eyes on the map. She wasn't looking at the convoy's route. She was looking at the topography around it, at the narrow passes and high ridges the storm would soon swallow in a sea of white. She listened to Madsen's confident pronouncements, her expression utterly unreadable, her silence a deep, still pool in the noisy, self-assured room. Her dismissal was complete. To every person in the room, from the colonel down to the lowest private, she was an irrelevance, a specter at the feast. The storm did not arrive in 24 hours. It slammed into Kestrel's perch in less than 6, a raging beast of wind and blinding snow. The temperature plummeted. The world beyond the thin canvas walls of the tents dissolved into a howling white void. It was faster and far more violent than any forecast had predicted. Inside the TOC, the atmosphere of calm control evaporated. The first sign of trouble was a flicker on the main communications console. The primary SATCOM link, the FOB's lifeline to the outside world, went dead. "Comms 1 is down," a specialist shouted over the roar of the wind against the tent. "Switching to secondary." Colonel Madsen, his face tight, nodded. "Get it back up. What's the status of the troposcatter link?" "Link established, sir," the tech replied, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "But the signal is degrading fast. Something's interfering." As if on cue, a wave of electronic chaos swept through the center. The digital map of the area flickered, then pixelated into a meaningless jumble of colors. Perimeter sensor alarms began to scream, a dozen at once, from different sectors. Then, just as suddenly, they all went silent. The screens that showed the feeds from the watchtowers went black, one by one. "What the hell is going on?" Madsen demanded, his voice sharp with the first edge of panic. "It's not the storm, sir," a young analyst stammered, his face pale. "This is coordinated. It's an EW attack. They're blinding us." At that precise moment, a garbled burst of static erupted from the speakers. Through the noise, a single, panicked voice could be heard. "Horses hit. Repeat. Pack horses. Ambush at kill zone. Taking heavy." The transmission cut out, replaced by the hiss of dead air. Silence fell in the TOC, a heavy, suffocating blanket punctured only by the storm's fury. The convoy had been ambushed. Chaos erupted. Phones buzzed with no signal. Radio operators shouted into dead microphones. Analysts stared at blank screens. The entire nervous system of the FOB had been severed. Colonel Madsen, A man whose entire career was built on plans and procedures was suddenly without either. His framework had collapsed. "Get me a location on that convoy," he roared, striding over to the dead map. "Where was their last transmission?" "We can't, sir. The GPS link is down. All systems are ghosted." "The quick reaction force," Matson snapped, turning to his executive officer. "Get them mounted up. Full combat load. They roll in 5 minutes." "Sir, which way?" the XO asked, his voice strained. "We have no idea where they are. We'd be sending them blind into that blizzard, and into whatever hit the convoy." Matson's face was a mask of frustration and impotence. He was a commander with no eyes, no ears, and no voice. His authority, once absolute, was now meaningless. He was shouting orders into a void, his men looking to him for a plan he didn't have. The TOC, his sanctuary of control, had become a pressure cooker of fear and confusion. The men, trained to follow, were faltering because their leader was lost. Kestrel's perch was deaf, blind, and bleeding, and the man in charge had no idea how to stop it. In the corner of the room, the invisible woman moved. While the TOC devolved into organized panic, Evelyn Reed stepped away from the wall. There was no haste in her movement, no alarm on her face. She moved with a quiet economy of motion, a startling island of calm in the churning sea of chaos. She walked directly to the main communications console, where a young specialist was frantically trying to reboot a dead system. "It's no use, ma'am," the specialist said, not even looking up, his voice cracking with stress. "They've got us locked out. There's a total system compromise. They're spoofing our handshakes, cycling through frequencies faster than we can track. We're completely isolated." Reed looked past him, her eyes scanning the complex array of screens and blinking lights. "Step aside," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the surrounding noise with surgical precision. The specialist looked up, bewildered. "Ma'am, you don't understand." "Get out of the chair," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. Colonel Matson, seeing her at the console, finally found a target for his frustration. "Get that civilian away from there now," he bellowed. "This is a restricted area." Reed paid him no mind. The specialist, intimidated by her sheer force of will, hesitated for a second before scrambling out of the seat. Reed slid into his place. Her fingers, which had looked merely old and worn, danced across the keyboard. She wasn't typing frantically. Her movements were fluid, precise, and impossibly fast. She wasn't trying to fight the electronic warfare on its own terms. She was bypassing it entirely. She pulled up a system schematic, her eyes darting across the digital blueprint of the FOB's entire electronic infrastructure. She ignored the primary and secondary comms arrays. Her fingers flew, entering lines of code, redirecting power from non-essential systems, shunting it away from the compromised mainframes. She was tapping into something old, something forgotten. In the far corner of the TOC, a dusty, neglected piece of equipment hummed to life. It was a Mark IV laserburst transmitter, a relic from a previous generation of warfare, considered obsolete and left to gather dust. It operated on a tight, line-of-sight beam of light, a primitive technology that modern EW suites weren't designed to detect or jam. Align the transmitter housing to azimuth 274, elevation 1 to 5, she commanded without looking away from her screen. A terrified but obedient tech scrambled to the unit's manual controls and began cranking the wheels. "Lock it on the K2 satellite relay. It's a dormant bird, but it's still up there." She turned to the stunned Chief Comms officer. "Get me a secure channel to the Joint Signals Intelligence Directorate at Bagram Airfield. Use authentication protocol Nightfall Veto." The officer just stared at her. "Ma'am, what is Nightfall Veto? That's not a recognized protocol." Reed didn't answer. She typed the alphanumeric string herself. A new window opened on her screen, a stark black background with a single line of green text. // env _protocol _accepted. Channel secure. Standby // A direct, encrypted link, completely independent of the standard military network, flickered to life. The comms officer looked as if he had just witnessed a resurrection. Reed stood up and walked to the now useless main tactical map. She swiped her hand across the pixelated screen, clearing it to a basic topographical display. Last known position of the convoy before the signal died, she said. It was a command. The XO, shaken out of his stupor, pointed to a blinking red dot. Here, sir, ma'am. At the entrance to Waypoint Zulu. Reed's eyes narrowed. She traced a line on the map with her finger, away from the blinking dot. They weren't ambushed there, she stated. That was bait. The distress call was designed to pull your QRF into open ground. The storm is cover. The real attack is here. She tapped a location 3 kilometers to the east. A narrow, winding pass known as the Serpent's Tooth. They're using the blizzard to mask their approach. They're setting up mortars and heavy machine guns on the high ground right now. They'll collapse the pass, cutting us off completely. Then, once we're isolated, the main assault force will hit our eastern perimeter. This isn't a raid on a convoy. This is a siege. The air in the tent grew thick. Her analysis was swift, terrifying, and utterly convincing. It recontextualized everything, shifting the crisis from a failed rescue to a desperate defense. Madsen, his face flushed with a combination of anger and humiliation, finally found his voice. He strode toward her, his fists clenched. And just who in the hell do you think you are? You are a civilian observer. You have no authority here. I am in command of this FOB, and I will not have my orders countermanded by a clerk. Reed's calm finally broke, but not into anger. It sharpened into something harder, something infinitely more dangerous. The air around her seemed to drop 10 degrees. She turned to face Madsen, but her words were not for him. "Sergeant Croft," she called out, her voice a blade that sliced through the lingering chaos. Croft, who had been posted at the TOC entrance to maintain security, flinched as if struck. All eyes turned to him. He straightened instinctively, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed attention of a soldier hearing a voice of true command. "You will take your fire team," Reed said, her eyes boring into him. "This is not a rescue mission. This is a counter-ambush. Your insertion point is here." She pointed to a ravine on the map that offered a covered approach to the Serpent's Tooth. "You will find an enemy platoon, approximately 30 strong, establishing a fire support base on this ridge. You are to neutralize their command element and their mortar teams. Speed and violence are your only allies. Air support is blind, and exfil is not guaranteed. You will move on foot and you will be silent. Your exfiltration route is back through this wash. Am I clear?" Croft was paralyzed. He looked from the terrifyingly confident woman to the apoplectic colonel. He was caught between two crushing forces. "Ma'am," he started, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Madsen, desperate for guidance. "You will do no such thing, Sergeant." Madsen bellowed, his face purple with rage. "I am giving you a direct order. You will stand down. You will follow my orders." Croft was trapped. His training, his career, his very instincts screamed at him to obey the colonel, the man with the eagles on his collar. But every fiber of his being told him that the woman was right. Her plan felt lethal, precise, and correct. Madsen's felt like a blunt, desperate flailing. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Croft said, his voice pleading now. "I don't know who you are. I take my orders from the colonel." He said it with the rigid formality of a soldier stating an undeniable fact. Then, in a moment of pure, desperate confusion, seeking some kind of resolution to the impossible situation, he asked the question that hung in the air like a live grenade. "I mean, what's your rank, anyway?" It wasn't a joke this time. It wasn't condescending. It was a raw, terrified plea for clarity. Who was this person who spoke with the authority of a god, who had resurrected dead technology and seen through the fog of war with such impossible clarity? A profound silence descended upon the TOC. The howl of the wind outside seemed to fade away. Every person in the tent, Madsen, the XO, the analysts, the techs, Croft, was frozen, their attention fixed on the unassuming woman in the plain gray jacket. Evelyn Reed did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She turned her head slowly, fixing her pale, icy gaze directly on Sergeant Croft. The quiet observer was gone. The auditor was gone. In her place stood something ancient and formidable. When she spoke, her voice was low, devoid of any emotion save the crushing weight of absolute authority. "General Evelyn Reed," she said. "4 stars." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Sergeant Croft froze completely. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, pale color. His jaw went slack, and his eyes, wide with shock, fixed on her. The smug, confident NCO he had been just hours ago shattered into a million pieces. In his place was a young soldier staring at a ghost from a history book. The name Reed echoed in the deep recesses of his memory, a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones by old instructors at the academy. The architect, the ghost of the Zagreus, the strategist behind a dozen black book operations that were the stuff of military legend, a figure so senior, so far removed from the dirt and grime of a place like this, that her presence here was as likely as a lightning strike indoors. Colonel Madsen was equally poleaxed. His rage collapsed into stunned, horrified disbelief. He stared at her, searching for any sign of a bluff, any hint of delusion. He found nothing but the cold, hard certainty of command presence he hadn't seen since he was a young lieutenant in the presence of a divisional commander during the Gulf War. He knew that name. Every officer above the rank of major knew that name. To falsely claim that rank in a combat zone in the middle of a crisis wasn't just a lie. It was a career-ending, court-martial-worthy act of such catastrophic insanity that no one would ever dare attempt it. It had to be true. The realization washed over him like ice water. The woman he had dismissed as a clerk, patronized as a nuisance, and ignored as an irrelevance was, in fact, one of an exceedingly small number of human beings who held the highest operational rank in the entire United States Armed Forces. Reed didn't give them time to process it. She didn't wait for an apology or a salute. The revelation was not for her ego. It was a tool, a key to unlock a necessary action. She immediately turned back to the tactical map, her focus absolute. "Colonel Madsen," she said, her tone now that of a superior officer addressing a subordinate, "you will immediately redeploy your perimeter defenses. Pull your reserve element from the western gate and reinforce the eastern approach. The enemy's main assault will come from there, and it will come within the hour. Your quick reaction force will be held in reserve here." She tapped a central staging area on the map. "They are to remain on standby as a mobile counterattack force, to be deployed only on my order after Sergeant Croft has neutralized the enemy's fire support. Do you understand your orders, Colonel?" The phrase "your orders" hung in the air, stripping away any last vestige of ambiguity. She was in command. This was now her battle. For a long second, Madsen's pride warred with his training, his ego with the dawning, terrifying reality of the situation. He looked at the map, at the strategy she had laid out in seconds. It was audacious, unconventional, and brilliant. It was a scalpel cut, where his plan had been a clumsy hammer blow. It was the only plan that offered them a chance of survival. He swallowed, the sound loud in the silent tent. His entire rigid, by-the-book world had been turned upside down. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by the grim, humbled focus of a professional soldier receiving a valid command. "Yes," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. He cleared his throat and straightened his back, the ingrained discipline taking over. "Yes, General." He turned to his XO and the comms officer, his voice now sharp and clear, all paralysis gone. "You heard the General. Relay those orders. Move." The TOC exploded back into life, but the energy was different now. The panic was gone, replaced by a frantic, focused purpose. They had a plan. More than that, they had a leader who could see the whole board. Sergeant Croft, who had been standing as if turned to stone, snapped back to reality. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He slammed his fist to his chest and then executed the sharpest, most perfect salute of his entire life. His eyes locked on Reed's back. "Ma'am!" he barked. his voice tight with awe and adrenaline. He didn't wait for a response. He spun on his heel and sprinted from the tent, shouting for his squad. Sanchez, Miller, on me. Move, move, move. His men, hearing the raw urgency in his voice, fell in without question. As they ran for their gear, Croft's mind reeled. He was no longer just following orders. He was a chosen instrument, a blade wielded by a legend. The weight of that mission settled on him, a terrifying and exhilarating burden. From the relative sanctuary of the TOC, General Reed orchestrated the defense of Kestrel's Perch. She was a conductor pulling music from a broken orchestra. Using the restored lasercom link, she fed a stream of data to Bagram, receiving back fragmented satellite imagery and signals intelligence from assets she had redirected with her override authority. She was painting a picture of the battlefield from scraps of information, her mind processing the data with terrifying speed. Matson stood beside her, no longer a commander but a witness. He watched her anticipate the enemy's movements, reroute patrols to intercept probing attacks, and position his forces with the prescient skill of a grandmaster playing chess. He saw her notice a subtle power fluctuation in the enemy's jamming frequency and correctly deduce it meant their mobile EW unit was repositioning for the main assault, giving him a 5-minute warning. Snippets of radio traffic, patched through the single secure channel, told the story of the battle unfolding in the blizzard. First, Croft's voice, low and tense. Contact. Enemy element sighted. Moving to engage then, the muffled sounds of suppressed gunfire, a sharp, violent exchange in the swirling snow. A few minutes later, Croft's breathless report, fire support neutralized. Enemy command element down. We are Oscar Mike. Almost immediately, the main assault hit the eastern perimeter, just as Reed had predicted. A wave of insurgents, believing the FOB to be blind and its fire support silenced, charged out of the whiteout. They were met not by a token defense, but by Matson's entire reserve force, dug in and waiting. The attackers were slaughtered. Matson watched the tactical display, which Reed's team at Bagram was slowly piecing back together, as the enemy icons faltered, broke, and then fled. She had not just defended the FOB. She had turned the enemy's own plan into a devastating trap. An hour later, the assault was broken. The last pockets of resistance were mopped up. A heavy, profound silence fell over the TOC, broken only by the hum of the now stable generators and the weary sighs of the operators. The crisis was over. Colonel Matson looked at General Reed, who was staring at the map, her face impassive. He felt a wave of shame so profound it was almost sickening. He had not just underestimated her. He had been contemptuous, dismissive, and utterly wrong. He had been a fool, and his foolishness had almost cost every man under his command their lives. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind died down, and the rising sun cast a pale, ethereal light across the snow-covered mountains, turning the landscape into a breathtaking vista of blue and gold. The air was clean, cold, and still. General Reed stood just outside the TOC, a simple metal mug of coffee steaming in her hands. The adrenaline had faded, and in its place, a deep weariness had settled into her features. She looked older now, the lines on her face deeper, etched by the weight of the night's decisions. She watched the first rays of sun touch the distant peaks. A figure approached, moving with the stiff, exhausted gait of a soldier coming off a long patrol. It was Sergeant Croft. His face was smeared with camouflage paint and grime, and there was a fresh tear in his combat jacket. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away, his posture rigid, his earlier swagger completely gone. He didn't know what to say. The chasm between the man who had mocked her in the mess hall and the man standing before her now was immeasurable. "Ma'am," he began, his voice hoarse. She turned to him. There was no recrimination in her eyes, no hint of an "I told you so." There was only the quiet, appraising look of a commander assessing her soldier. "Report, Sergeant," she said, her voice soft but firm. Croft snapped into his training. He delivered a crisp, formal after-action report, detailing the counter-ambush at the Serpent's Tooth. He listed the enemy casualties, the captured equipment, the status of his own men, 2 with minor injuries but all accounted for. His voice was steady, professional, but it held a new tone, one of profound, unshakable respect. When he finished, Reed simply nodded. "Good work, Sergeant. See to your men. Get them warm food and medical attention." It was a dismissal, but it felt like a benediction. As Croft was about to turn and leave, he hesitated. He reached into a pouch on his vest. "General," he said, his voice dropping. We found this on their commander." He held out a small, ruggedized data chip. "We couldn't have gotten it. We wouldn't have known where to look. Not without you." The apology he couldn't speak hung in the cold, clear air between them. She took the chip, her weathered fingers brushing against his. The brief contact felt like an absolution. "You did your duty, Sergeant Croft," she said quietly. "That is all that ever matters." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He gave her a final, quick nod of respect and walked away to rejoin his squad, a different man than he had been 12 hours before. A few moments later, Colonel Madsen emerged from the TOC. He walked to her side, and for a long minute he said nothing. He simply stood there, following her gaze to the horizon. The shame was still on his face, but it was now tempered with a deep, intellectual awe. Finally he spoke, his voice low and humbled. "I've read your files, General. The declassified ones, at least. From the Academy. The Architect, they teach your strategies as doctrine now. I never thought. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I apologize, General Reed." She took a slow sip of her coffee, the steam warming her face. "You held the line when it mattered, Colonel," she replied, her gaze still on the mountains. "That's what you're trained for. No plan survives contact with the enemy. The test isn't in making the perfect plan. It's in adapting when it breaks." She held out the data chip Croft had given her. "Your intel teams will want to analyze this. It should give you a clear picture of the network that financed and supplied this operation." In that simple gesture, she was handing command back to him. She was restoring the order she had been forced to break. Madsen looked at the chip, then at her. He understood the symbolism. He was still the commander of Kestrel's Perch. She had saved it, but it was his to run. He took the chip, his hand closing around the small, vital piece of intelligence. "Thank you, General," he said, the words carrying a universe of meaning. In the distance, the familiar, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter's rotors began to echo through the valley. Her transport was arriving. Reed finished the last of her coffee and placed the empty mug on the railing of a nearby sandbag emplacement. She gave a final, brief nod to Madsen, a silent acknowledgement that their business was concluded. Then, without another word, she turned and began walking toward the makeshift landing zone. Across the FOB, soldiers stopped what they were doing. They emerged from their tents, from the mess hall, from the motor pool. They stood in silence, watching the solitary figure in the plain gray jacket walk toward the inbound Black Hawk. The whispers had already spread like wildfire. The old woman, the auditor, the pencil pusher was General Evelyn Reed. The architect, a living legend, had walked among them, and they hadn't even seen her. As she climbed aboard the helicopter, she didn't look back. The door slid shut, and the aircraft lifted off, its rotor wash kicking up a fresh swirl of white powder from the ground. The soldiers of Task Force Vigilance watched it shrink into the vast, blue sky until it was just a speck, then nothing at all. They stood there for a long time, in the cold morning air, their mockery and dismissal replaced by a silent, enduring respect for the ghost who had come in the storm and saved them all.